Dr. Miller is currently at work on a book tentatively titled The Birth of a New Freedom, The Progressive Transformation of American Governance, where she is exploring the philosophical origins, character, and domestic policy impact of the turn of the 20th century progressive movement on the early New Deal. We look forward to that volume seeing the light of day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Miller, who will speak on the topic, Is the United States Still a Liberal Democracy? Dr. Miller.
Well, we'll see how the audio works here. I wanted to begin this evening by thanking you all for taking time out of your very precious Sunday evening to come join with us in celebrating this long UD tradition and celebrating something that is eminently worth celebrating. I want to pay special thanks to Interim Dean Hicks for joining us this evening, and my colleagues, as always, for coming. As Rich said, the title of my talk this evening is The United States Still a Liberal Democracy? Now, it is frequently observed that the United States has the oldest written constitution in the world. By this very evening, we are celebrating our Constitution's 231st anniversary, 231 years. On the face of it, the age of our Constitution suggests great strength and solidity. It suggests that the Constitution and the fundamental ideas of individual liberty and the consent of the governed which inspired it remain as deeply rooted in the American psyche as ever. So confident are some in this regard that they believe it's simply unthinkable that any American, much less any influential American, would ever openly advocate overturning the First Amendment, much less the Constitution more generally. For conservatives like these, the greatest challenge America faces today is not that our commitment to liberalism is coming undone, but that our unwavering commitment to liberalism will be our eventual undoing. I am not so sanguine. But let us begin by acknowledging that it is not so easy to assess just how solidly entrenched any long-established regime actually is. Richard Pipes, the venerable historian of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union, notes that no one in 1917 predicted that Tsarism in Russia, which was then around 370 years old, would soon collapse. On the contrary, he writes, people believed that Tsarism would survive for a long time to come. One of the reasons the Russian radical revolutionaries and even liberals acted with such reckless abandon against the regime was their conviction that they could do so with impunity, because it was virtually indestructible. Just 7 weeks before the last Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne, Vladimir Lenin himself actually predicted that he and his generation would not live to see a revolution in Russia. Likewise, as Pipes notes, almost no one foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In each case, the world was, as Pipes put it, caught unawares, because it thought that Tsarism and communism were both far more deeply rooted than they really were. Gauging just how solidly entrenched any long-established regime actually is would thus seem to be a difficult thing to do. If we want to get a more accurate sense of just how ingrained the liberalism of the American founding remains then, we must seek to discover just how influential those ideas have been over the course of American history. Fortunately for you, I am not going to undertake an exhaustive exploration of that subject, but I do want to hit on some high points. If we were to begin such an assessment by examining the intellectual movement so obviously rending higher education in the United States today, and whose sensibilities are now aggressively pushing into every other aspect of American life, one is struck by how unabashedly illiberal it is. This movement, which is frequently called the social justice movement, is a rather recent phenomenon, although various American and European academics have been laying its theoretical foundations for well over the past half-century. Many conservatives continue calling these social justice activists liberals out of a many decades old and rather sleepy habit of referring to progressives as liberals. But this habit does not lend itself to intellectual clarity, nor by extension the exercise of prudence. For whether one examines the roots of the social justice movement's militant activism, which appear to lay in a somewhat paradoxical admixture of Marxism, communist practice, and postmodern theory, or simply the activists' self-understanding and the practical policy changes they are demanding, one is hard-pressed to see why it makes any sense to continue calling it liberal. Liberalism, to be sure, has become a grossly convoluted term, but it used to have a more precise meaning. Its defining principle is the idea that human beings, as human beings, are entitled to exercise a host of negative rights or freedoms, including the freedom of speech and free exercise of religion. Today's social justice movement is profoundly hostile, both on epistemological and practical grounds, to this principle. From the standpoint of today's activists, rights do not inhere in individuals equally by virtue of a common humanity. In fact, they frequently deny the very existence of human nature. Rather, rights are contingent upon a given individual's group identity and vary widely in relation to what exactly that identity is. The reason for this radical inequality of rights is that the social justice movement conceives of the United States in a manner reminiscent of, if not simply identical to, the way Karl Marx conceived of the nature of a capitalist society. Just as Marx characterized capitalist societies as being starkly divided into a ruling or oppressor class, the bourgeoisie, which used the law and every other aspect of culture to perpetuate its exploitation of the ruled class, the proletariat, so the social justice movement regards the United States as being starkly divided into a ruling class comprised of various identities, which systemically discriminates against an oppressed class comprised of a growing number of victim group identities. From the activist point of view, then, on the one hand, we have the members of the ruling class. These are the haters, whose ranks have been increasing over the years, but whose members would now seem primarily to include those who are white, male, heterosexual, Christian or Jewish, and most recently, cis-normative. On the other hand, we have the oppressed class or identities, including non-white racial minorities, women, gays, transgenders, Muslims, etc. As with the Marxist critique of capitalist society, the object of the social justice movement's activism is not to ensure that our government impartially secures to everyone the same legal rights regardless of class standing or identity. From the activist standpoint, all this would do is perpetuate the discrimination that has caused and continues the marginalization of the oppressed identities in the first place. Instead, then, the activists seek to deny to the members of the ruling class the legal rights whose exercise perpetuates discrimination, especially the legal rights, freedom of speech, and free exercise of religion. This is why the social justice movement is always accused of employing double standards, of excoriating or celebrating the exact same type of speech or action depending upon the identity of the person who utters or does it. But this is no mere hypocrisy on their part, but a genuine reflection of how they conceive the character of American society and the radically unequal steps necessary to correct or rectify it. In this new way of thinking, then, those deemed to be members of the ruling class, the so-called haters, must be deprived of any opportunity to speak. They must be no-platformed and increasingly punished if they dare speak for violating hate speech or bias codes. Hundreds of college campuses now have administrative entities called bias response teams, BRTs, to investigate and punish allegations of bias on campus. Of course, the most militant activist groups like the misleadingly named Antifa, are too impatient to wait to punish so-called hate speech after the fact, and are increasingly resorting to violence to silence it before it can even begin. But even if so-called hate speech were to be punished after the fact, it is still profoundly liberal in its political import. In order to get some clearer sense of this, one must ask what all speech falls into the forbidden category of hate speech or bias, right? So what all falls into that category? This is actually difficult to do because the frontiers of the forbidden are not only continually expanding, but are also frequently left uncodified. Still, one can get some rough sense of just how severely social justice activists would curtail the freedom of speech. Take, for example, just one single category of hate speech, racism. Today's activists are not content simply to ban professions that most Americans would regard as deeply morally repugnant anyway, e.g. professions of biologically based racial political superiority like those espoused by the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazis. They would not only ban such overt racism, but would also go considerably further to reach what they regard as more subtle and hence deeper forms of racism called implicit bias or microaggressions. Indeed, according to the University of California, my alma mater, which, by the way, helped pioneer some of the earliest campus speech codes back in the 1990s, examples of such forms of racism would include statements like, quote, "There is only one race, the human race," end quote, and, quote, "I don't believe in race," end quote. In other words, from the standpoint of today's social justice movement, speech that denies the relevance of race to moral and political reasoning is now actually racist. It is no exaggeration to say that today's activists see no meaningful distinction between the political positions taken by Adolf Hitler or the Ku Klux Klan on the one hand and the American founders on the other. As the Duke sociologist who wrote a book entitled Racism Without Racists explains, quote, "The main problem nowadays is not the folks with the hoods, but the folks dressed in suits, that is, ordinary Americans. Things have come to such an astonishing pass on many college campuses today that one wonders whether a white person could even recite Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, 'I Have a Dream' speech with impunity." It is important to see what is happening to speech, on college campuses, not because it necessarily confounds the First Amendment, though that is more of an issue on state campuses, but because it is a harbinger of what the activists believe must be done in America generally. In other words, if the social justice movement acquires the same degree of control over the power of our government that they presently wield on college campuses, they will do for America what they have done for the college campus. It's true, of course, that the Supreme Court has yet to recognize the concept of hate speech as a legitimate restriction on the freedom of speech. But anyone who has observed how relatively quickly the court has reversed itself in recent decades in controversial areas like, for example, gay rights, can hardly take much comfort in this. And make no mistake, the cultural pressure to constitutionalize restrictions on hate speech has been and is continuing to grow. Younger Americans, those who are most directly shaped by our universities, are more receptive to hate speech restrictions on First Amendment freedoms than our older Americans. They are also more receptive to the idea that violence is the appropriate response to speech they deem offensive. These are alarming trends. But at least such illiberal ideas are a relatively recent vintage, right? I mean, how quickly, really, could illiberal ideas efface America's long commitment to liberalism? With the major exception of the slavery crisis, haven't Americans always embraced and applied liberal ideas? Isn't there a fundamental theoretical continuity tying the classical liberalism of the founding to the reform movement called modern liberalism in the early 20th century? If the reform movement that became known as modern liberalism actually was the kind of reform movement it has long been characterized as being, if, that is, modern liberals were simply liberals who were seeking to apply their principles amid the changing economic circumstances of post-Civil War America, this would be true. The problem with this characterization is that when one actually looks into how the academic pioneers of the so-called modern liberalism describe their own thinking about politics, they describe it as being self-consciously anti-liberal. Far from endorsing the liberal understanding of the origin and purpose of government, they flatly repudiate it. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first example is from Charles E. Merriam. Merriam is little remembered today, but he was one of the leading political scientists of the early 20th century. In 1900, Merriam began teaching at the University of Chicago after completing his PhD under the co-direction of William Archibald Dunning at Columbia and Otto von Guericke at the University of Berlin. During his time at Chicago, Merriam also became very actively involved in progressive reform. Among other things, he was intimately involved in the organization of Theodore Roosevelt's National Progressive Party of 1912, TR's famous Bull Moose campaign. Merriam also notably played a leading role in the little-known but remarkably ambitious foray into comprehensive national planning during FDR's New Deal. It was called the National Resources Planning Board. In 1903, Merriam published a book called A History of American Political Theories. In this book, Merriam notes the rise of what he himself calls a new school of political theory in the United States, one which he traces primarily to the influence of Americans who, like himself, obtained a higher education in various German universities. This new school of political theory, he writes, and I quote, shows a decided tendency away from many doctrines that were held by the men of 1776. The revolutionary doctrines of an original state of nature, natural rights, the social contract, the idea that the function of government is limited to the protection of person and property. None of these finds wide acceptance among the leaders in the development of political science. The great service rendered by these doctrines under other and earlier conditions is fully recognized, and the presence of a certain element of truth in them is freely admitted, but they are no longer generally received as the best explanation for political phenomena. From the standpoint of this new point of view, Merriam pointedly concludes, quote, the earlier explanation and philosophy of the state was not only false, but dangerous and misleading, end quote. Richard T. Ely provides a second example. Few, if any, progressives rival Ely's influence in founding the modern administrative state in America. Ely studied at various German universities where he worked with some of the leading members of the German Historical School of Economics. The historical school's influence upon his subsequent career in writing is pronounced. The German Historical School of Economics, by the way, advocated an approach to reform in Germany which its members came to call the socialism of the chair. The socialism of the chair was, in effect, non-Marxist socialism. Their brand of socialism, interestingly, is frequently cited by scholars as an important precursor to the rise of National Socialism in Germany. Ely, at any rate, spent the first 10 years of his career at Johns Hopkins University. In 1892, he left to chair a new department of economics, political science, and history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which he aspired to turn into the civil service equivalent of West Point. In other words, Ely sought to turn this new department into a breeding ground for the future expert administrators of the administrative state, a vision which, by the time of FDR's New Deal in the early 1930s, Ely was realizing in spades. All of FDR's boldest policy initiatives in social insurance, industrial planning, agricultural planning, and comprehensive national resource planning are direct outgrowths of Ely and his students' work and activism. Ely, like Merriam, could be astoundingly blunt about what he thought about the liberalism of the American founding. In 1914, he castigated a 1795 Supreme Court decision in which the court determined that, quote, the right of acquiring and possessing property and having it protected is one of the natural, inherent, and inalienable rights of man. This doctrine, Ely declares, quote, rests upon an unscientific 18th century social philosophy of natural rights existing prior to the formation of society and of a compact whereby men left a state of nature, surrendering liberties for the protection and other advantages, and binding forever all subsequent generations by their alleged voluntary compact. All this has long ago been totally discredited by science, end quote. Like his teachers in the German Historical School of Economics, in other words, Ely flatly rejected the liberalism of the Declaration of Independence. These examples from Merriam and Ely, moreover, are not cherry-picked anomalies. One finds them throughout the earlier progressives' writings. If the earlier progressives weren't evaluating the changing circumstances of their day from the standpoint of the founders' liberalism, what was their standpoint? What principles, in other words, guided the reforms they advocated? Early on, progressives like Merriam and Ely candidly opposed the liberalism of the American founding to a frankly social conception of the state inspired by German thought. This German conception of the state was frankly social in the sense that it denied that Americans possessed rights by nature that limited the extent to which the state could rightfully interfere with their actions, not only in the exercise of property rights, but in every aspect of their decision-making. The only limit on the state, as Ely was wont to say, was its, quote, ability to do good, end quote. From the standpoint of the earlier progressives, the general welfare, which they, in contrast to today's social justice movement, defined in terms of promoting the highest possible human excellence or perfection, and I mean that, should always take precedence over its members' private preferences. As ambitious as this conception of the state was, as considerable an expansion of public authority over private decision-making that it set in motion, Ely nonetheless occasionally describes it as a conservative socialism. That's his term. Stop and think about that. Ely's social conception of the state, though departing radically from the founders' liberalism, was nonetheless more conservative. More conservative, that is to say, not as radical or extreme in comparison to the socialist extreme, which was Marxism. And Ely's brand of socialism was indeed more conservative than Marxism in several respects. It pursued incremental reforms through existing or inherited institutions rather than violent revolution. It was not avowedly hostile to Christianity or to the family as a crucial social institution. And though it recognized the right of the state to abolish private property altogether, it nonetheless did not call for an immediate nationalization of private property. Though Ely himself made the case for industrial planning in the 1890s, and became by the teens the leading pioneer of land planning in the United States. The reform movement, which Miriam and Ely did so much to promote, inspired in 1914 the founding of a new magazine aptly entitled The New Republic. Some of you may have heard of this. The New Republic is frequently credited with founding so-called modern liberalism. The founding editor of The New Republic was Herbert Croly. In the 1920s, Croly hired a young progressive named George Sewell to bolster the editorial board. Sewell is probably best remembered today for writing the New Republic's review of George Orwell's Animal Farm, which he trashed. In 1931, Sewell wrote a very revealing editorial entitled Hard-Boiled Radicalism. This editorial was, as he subsequently explained, quote, the outcome of conversations among the editors of the New Republic, end quote, about the position of the progressive movement following Croly's death. In the editorial, Sewell pointedly explains that, quote, Croly ceased to call his public policy liberal with good reason. Politically, liberalism is bound up with the doctrine of natural rights, derived from such men as Rousseau and Locke, and given expression in the American Declaration of Independence and in parts of the Constitution, such as the 5th and 14th Amendments. The hollowness of the doctrine of natural rights and its positive injury to society when applied in a highly developed industrial civilization was one of Croly's favorite themes. Certainly, the New Republic has never stood for historic liberalism in public affairs, but for something radically different. What would this radically different alternative to the historical liberalism of the American founding look like in practice? Today's progressives, Sewell urges, quote, ought to make it plain that they are not betting on capitalism any more than they are betting on violent revolution. What they are, or should be betting on, is the disappearance of traditional capitalism or its change into something radically different. They ought to strive with all their powers to imagine what this new thing will be, to picture it and win faith in it. It will certainly have much in common with Russian communism, since that is an instance of a planned and controlled economy in the interest of all, one which tries to assure substantial equality of income, of opportunity, and of security. But if it does not come as the result of a single sudden overturn, it is bound to differ from Russian communism in many respects. It is likely to come in a piecemeal fashion over a longer period of time. Thus, the radically different alternative to the founders' historic liberalism for which the New Republic stood, and which became known as modern liberalism, would certainly have much in common with Russian communism. Sewell's position in this regard, by the way, was shared by some of Franklin Roosevelt's most influential policy advisors, including the brain truster Rexford G. Tugwell. Tugwell was an economist at Columbia, whose approach to reform was also profoundly shaped by the German Historical School of Economics. In 1932, he published an article in which he declared, quote, that the future was becoming visible in Russia, end quote. In the article, he urged Americans to embrace a conception of economic planning, which, though falling short of a thoroughgoing abolition of private property, would nonetheless move far in the direction of Soviet-style centralized economic planning. While he noted that many Americans had warmed to this idea, he worried that they did not understand just how radically economic planning would transform the traditional practice of business and politics in the United States. Economically speaking, he explains, embracing planning would mean that, quote, business will logically be required to disappear, end quote. This, he emphasized, was no exaggeration, but, quote, was literally meant, end quote. And the political changes planning would entail were no less radical. Just as it is, quote, a logical impossibility to have a planned economy and to have businesses operating its industries, Tugwell writes, it is also impossible to have one within our present constitutional structure. Modifications in both, so serious as to mean destruction and re-beginning, are required. In Tugwell's candid estimate, embracing planning would necessitate constitutional changes so serious as to require, again, destruction and re-beginning. Despite ambitious initiatives into industrial planning, agricultural planning, and more broadly comprehensive national resource planning, the New Deal plainly fell short of Tugwell's ultimate aspirations. But the frankly social conception of the state that underwrote Tugwell and the earlier progressive reform agenda lived on to catalyze further policy reforms, if ones of a more piecemeal nature, and is presently being turned in even more radical directions by contemporary progressives. Today, to the astonishment of many older Americans, we live in an America in which the public support for socialism, even of the communist variety, is openly resurgent. Let me, in view of this, close with one last observation. In the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn seeks to explain why it was that the Russian people submitted so relatively easily to the Bolsheviks' tyranny. We didn't love freedom enough, he writes, and even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. If the Russian people had more clearly grasped what their true situation was, if they had more clearly grasped what the Bolsheviks were doing and what all they planned to do, he suggests, they would have acted differently. Let us pray to God that we Americans do not make the same mistake. Thank you.